Welcome to the Caregiver Journey podcast. I'm your host, Kathy Jackson, and together we're creating a community that uplifts, empowers, and transforms the caregiving experience one family at a time. Let's do this. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Caregiver Journey podcast. As always, I'm really glad you're here. If this is your first time, this is a place you can come every week to be part of a caregiver community. We want this podcast to be positive, uplifting, relevant, and informational. This is a podcast for caregivers and their families. We talk about a lot of things. We talk about family dynamics, mental health, fitness, intimacy, spirituality, all of it. Nothing is off the table. But I'll tell you what, most importantly, I want this to be a place where we focus on the caregiver and commit to making those who serve others every day feel supported, loved, encouraged, and not alone in this journey. And for the families listening, I hope this podcast helps you to better understand how to engage in this complex journey and grow closer as a family unit. Well, this is episode 11. This is part 2 of the top 10 most cringeworthy moments in family caregiving. And well, it's at least my top 10. We covered 6 through 10 in episode 10. And if you've not heard that podcast, please go back and take a listen. I think you'll enjoy it. In episode 10, we covered intimacy, bodily functions, flirting, and a range of other interesting scenarios. Today, we're going to talk about cross-dressing, unwelcome visits from a hospice pastor, and driving under the influence. As I mentioned last week, this may not be a podcast for children. Now, as I did in the last podcast, let me set this up for you. When you've been caregiving for a while, whether that's days, weeks, months, or even years, there are going to be moments that bring tears to your eyes. There are going to be moments where you will question your own sanity, and there will be moments where the indignities for both you and your loved one require a special kind of resilience to survive the reality of what's happening right in front of you. And as always, it's not my intention to embarrass or make light of those we care for, but as a family caregiver, you can find yourself in some very strange situations. And because you're caring for a member of your family or even a close friend, there are certain sensitivities at play. Most of us don't have the option to simply walk away. Instead, we're being asked to deal with these moments with a lot of compassion, empathy, and sometimes a little humor, but always with grace and with dignity. Caregiving for a family member or friend puts additional stress on the situation because it requires you, the caregiver, to often engage in tasks that put both the patient and you in a very vulnerable situation. For those family members who are not caregiving but want to better understand how to support your family caregiver, this episode will shed a little light on some of the more, what I call, interesting aspects of caregiving. These are situations that are often not shared over eggs and bacon or even a stiff drink. All right, let's get this party started. The number 5 cringeworthy moment for me is what I'm calling hell no to the hospice pastor. For those of you who have been following me, you already know this story is most likely going to be about my mom, Shirley. My mom was diagnosed with lung cancer around the same time that my dad passed away in 2021. We found it ironic that she had lung cancer, although she never smoked a day in her life. But my dad, who was a heavy smoker for many years, loved his Camel cigarettes. For those of a certain age, you might remember the slogan, "I'd walk a mile for a Camel." And I believe my dad would have walked 2 miles for a Camel. I think he started smoking when he was in the Navy. Later, my parents became very involved in Christian ministry, and that was while I was in high school. So my dad quit smoking. Although more than once, when he would pick me up from band practice or theater practice, I would either catch him on his last puff or I could smell it when I got in the car. That remained our secret until now. However, my dad did pay the price with the diagnosis of COPD, and for the last several years of his life, he had to drag around an oxygen tank from room to room. My mom was an energetic, always on the move, spitfire of a woman who loved spending time with her friends. She loved engaging in travel and other activities, but often had to miss those things due to taking care of my dad. So after years of caregiving, her diagnosis of lung cancer and then eventually brain cancer, well, that was a hard pill to swallow. After my dad passed, she thought she could will herself healthy. Her initial response to the diagnosis was that she was going to beat it. But as time passed and she was eventually put on hospice, the reality of her diagnosis set in, and she resigned herself to the inevitable. Now, there are hospice patients who decide to use that time that they have left to grow closer to their family, engage in meaningful conversations, and even make amends to an extent. Well, not Shirley, not my mother. She was mad. She was mad at God. She had spent years in Christian ministry, fulfilling her obligations as a wife and a mother, and it was now her time, and God had shortchanged her. As challenging as my mother was throughout the years, I have to give her this one. The hand she was dealt, well, it was a crappy one. Once my mom was put on hospice, it became her job to challenge everything and create an atmosphere, unfortunately, of stress and discomfort. There were certain hospice services available to her, including, a hospital bed, some consumables, a nurse visit, music therapy, and an aide who would come in and bathe her once a week. But that one service that caused the most grief for all of us was the visit by the hospice pastor. Shirley wanted nothing to do with him. When I say his visits were cringeworthy, well, that's putting it lightly. For a woman who spent many, many years in Christian ministry, serving the Lord, she was letting God and his representative know that she was not happy with how this was playing out. I must give the pastor credit. He handled it like a pro. But I'll not forget how awkward those visits were and how Shirley was not letting him or us off the hook. She was curt, cold, and classic contentious Shirley. When I look back on those moments, it makes me, a little sad. But I also understand her frame of mind. Her greatest fear was missing out, and she was having to leave the party way too soon. My dad was ready to go. He talked often about going to heaven, seeing his mom, and being in the presence of Christ. My mom wasn't ready to go. End of life doesn't mean everything gets wrapped up in a nice, neat bow. In fact, end of life can mean a lot of unfinished business. Whether the end is expected or comes as a complete surprise, there are elements we have no control over. My mom's journey is a reminder that we should be living each day as if it's the last. I would say, rest in peace, Mom, but instead I'll say, dance as if no one's watching, Mom. All right, let's take a look at cringeworthy moment number 4. Have you ever had to take away a favorite toy from a toddler or ground a teenager from their phone? How about taking a driver's license away from a dementia patient? Tell you what, I would take the first 2 over the last any day. Let's call this one, drive it like it's hot. I'll be honest, I was always a little concerned about Mike's driving, but I've been married before, and my goal was to not be a backseat driver. Our trips from Indianapolis to West Lafayette, Indiana, to Purdue University, Mike's alma mater, were always an adventure. The drive is about an hour, but whether we were heading to a football game or attending an alumni event, Mike was always in a hurry to get there, and his driving reflected that. My only saving grace was putting my earbuds in and closing my eyes. If we got there in one piece, well, that was icing on the cake. But to be honest, there were other indicators prior to his diagnosis as well. We have a local shopping mall that's about 15 minutes from our house. Over the years, Mike had probably been to that mall no less than 500 times. And prior to his diagnosis, he began asking me directions on how do I get to the mall. Do I turn here? What road should I take? Again, I was concerned, but ruled it out because there was so much construction going on, and I also knew he had a lot on his mind. Funny, what will reason away because it's convenient, right? Over time, Mike slowly began relinquishing his driving to me, and I acted as if it wasn't a big deal, because it really wasn't for me. But it was clear his memory was struggling to recall patterns that he had been practicing almost his entire adult life. When it came time to renew his license, he was adamant that he wanted to go through that process. I knew we were now putting others in harm's way. And for several months, I used his expired license as a reason to not let him drive. But I always promised him a visit to that Bureau of Motor Vehicles every time he asked. But ultimately, he stopped asking. We took several road trips after his diagnosis, and I have memories of him in the passenger seat, nodding off or staring out the window. Mike had been in the driver's seat his entire life. He was a born leader. He ran his own company. He was used to being in charge. I often wondered how difficult it must have been for him to submit to this disease. Alzheimer's will exhaust you. It is relentless. Taking away his ability to drive was one of the most cringeworthy moments. Driving is an act of freedom, one of independence. It was one of the many pleasures of life that Alzheimer's took away from Mike over the next several years. In some ways, I was grateful for his memory loss, because had he been able to fully comprehend the complete loss of his independence, that would have destroyed him long before the dementia did. All right, let's lighten the mood a little bit and talk about cross-dressing. Didn't see that one coming, did you? This is cringeworthy moment number 3. We're going to call this one Sharp-Dressed Man for the ZZ Top fans. Mike was a CEO for over 3 decades. He traveled internationally, spoke to CEOs and executives all over the world. He was always impeccably dressed. Pressed shirts, suit jacket and pants tailored to fit, polished shoes, and he always smelled like $1,000,000. And in spite of all that, there was really nothing intimidating about Mike. He was personable, kind, charming. But the one thing that created the most anxiety for me was packing his suitcase for a trip. Everything had to be just right. I had to make sure that no matter how long the trip, that nothing would get wrinkled or was out of place. He had one of those folding boards. If you ever watch Big Bang Theory, Sheldon has one of these. It's a flat board with hinges on it that allows you to perfectly fold your shirts. Mike was always happy to pack his own suitcase, but I loved the challenge. So it was often my responsibility to get that done. As the disease of Alzheimer's began to take over his brain, his ability to look put together declined significantly. He became less interested in keeping up appearances and more interested in comfort. Brooks Brothers suits were replaced with t-shirts and sweats. Leather loafers were replaced with slip-on Velcro tennis shoes. When I moved Mike to memory care, we provided laundry soap, but the staff did the laundry. Often, with 30-plus patients in memory care, someone's laundry would end up in Mike's room and vice versa. It wasn't a big deal until one day I was visiting with Mike and noticed his sweater looked particularly small. Either he had gained weight or it had shrunk in the laundry. As I looked a bit closer, I realized Mike was wearing a woman's sweater from the Jaclyn Smith collection. For those who don't know Jaclyn Smith, she was one of the original Charlie's Angels, along with Farrah Fawcett and Kate Jackson. That show aired in 1976. Can you believe it? It wouldn't be the first or the last time I would find Mike wearing other people's clothing. If you listened to my last podcast, you know Mike had a girlfriend in memory care named Mary, and Mary would often be wearing something of Mike's, and Mike would be squeezed into something of Mary's. Dementia requires that you let go of the things that no longer serve you. It requires you to let go of your ego, unrealistic expectations, and biases. When your loved one has Alzheimer's, you learn to live in their world and let go of the things that really don't matter. And in our case, it meant letting go of the need to show up in the world a certain way. And to be honest, there was a lot of freedom and independence in that. Good for Mike. All right, let's tackle cringeworthy moment number 2. I'm calling this story Naked on the Job. One of the most challenging aspects of caregiving for someone who has dementia is that their actions often become very unpredictable. As the disease progresses, they begin to exhibit behaviors that are not necessarily socially acceptable. They may become rude, combative, physically abusive, or even amorous at the most inappropriate times. That's the reason that family caregivers who care for someone with dementia in particular often become isolated, depressed, and very lonely. The challenge of remaining social while caring for someone with dementia is extremely challenging. Now, this situation took place during COVID. I was working remotely, and most of my day consisted of video calls. I was doing the delicate dance of trying to keep Mike occupied and doing my job. It was not an easy lift. I had security cameras and alarms on every door. That way, if he tried to wander, I'd be notified immediately. At one point, I was on a call with a coworker, and we were discussing, I think, an upcoming meeting. I could hear Mike in the hallway outside my office, so I felt comfortable that he was safe and probably distracted. However, before I knew it, in walked my naked husband with a big smile on his face. Thank God I had the wherewithal to turn my camera off before he was within view. Now, there have been many moments in my caregiving experience that caused me to, pause and take stock of the situation. What needs to change? What type of pivot do we need to make now? In this case, I need to do a 180. I needed help during the day if I had any plans to keep my job. Try explaining that one to your boss. And by the way, we have millions of employed caregivers out there trying to juggle work, caregiving, and numerous cringeworthy situations, all while holding it down. Well, here we are, the number 1 most cringeworthy moment in caregiving, and I'm calling this story Through the Looking Glass. You know what? This story is not about Mike. It's not about my mom. It's about me. I recently listened to a podcast by Mel Robbins called Finally Feel Good in Your Body. During that podcast, she talks about how we were never meant to be so obsessed with our own looks. Social media, video calls, all have forced us to look at ourselves and scrutinize our appearance to an extent it has become unhealthy, even toxic. But I can honestly say, while Mike had dementia, I rarely looked in the mirror. My goal about 2 years into the dementia journey was to get out of bed, get through the workday, and pray for a decent night's sleep. Prior to dementia, I took pride in my appearance. I treated my mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual health as a priority. Mike's diagnosis changed all of that. I stopped working out, lost a lot of sleep, felt depressed, didn't go to church, and paid very little attention to my nutrition. My sole focus was on Mike and his well-being. And I slowly began to lose myself. I became an empty shell. I remember waking up one day with Mike next to me. He was staring up at the ceiling, waiting for me to tell him what we were going to do next. And I began to cry and cry and cry. I couldn't stop. The tears kept coming. Mike was so confused by my emotional outburst. He had no idea what was happening. I remember saying to him, I can't do this anymore. I have nothing left. But eventually I got up, went into the bathroom, and I happened to look in the mirror. Something I had avoided doing for years because I knew I had let myself go and I didn't want to deal with the aftermath. But something interesting happened when I looked in the mirror that morning. At first glance, I saw a depleted, worn out, exhausted, overweight, gray-haired, aging woman. But then, as I looked more closely, I saw something else. I saw battle scars. I saw bleeding wounds. I saw wrapped bandages caused by a long, hard-fought, multi-year war that had been playing out in the trenches. And in that moment, all I could think was how proud I was of that woman, that warrior, how incredible that soldier was. She had stayed on that battlefield despite everything. She didn't turn and run. She faced the fight head on. She was resilient. She was amazing. She was a badass. What began as my most cringeworthy moment became my most transformative moment. My glance in the mirror that day became my saving grace. I saw myself in a completely new light. I no longer cared how anyone else saw me, what they thought, or how I showed up in the world. My scars and wounds were my badges of honor. But I also knew I needed to reclaim, rebuild, and renew my life. My journey wasn't over. My journey of transformation was just beginning. My caregiving experience allowed me to see how strong and powerful I was. Cringeworthy moments? No problem. What else you got? Bring it on, baby. And now, let's move on to living life's lessons. I believe no matter what life throws at you, there's an opportunity to learn and grow and evolve. I look back on my caregiving experience, and in the worst of times, to survive, I didn't require myself to put my best foot forward. I just needed to show up. And that's where the transformation began, with a single, sometimes awkward, always cringeworthy step. Personal growth under all types of circumstances begins with self-awareness, allowing yourself to be vulnerable and transparent. Caregiving stripped my ego. It destroyed my pride. It massacred my image. And once all of the masks were removed, I could now begin to envision a more authentic life. I spent far too much time chasing opinions, looking for validation, and seeking approval. What a waste of time. Caregiving required me to focus on the rawness of life. It pushed me to my limit and made me realize I could stretch my resilience far beyond my wildest dreams. So, what was the one thing I learned from almost 10 years of cringeworthy situations? I learned that sanctification is a long and grueling process. What do I mean by that? Well, stay tuned. And now, we're in this mess. Are you, God? I have a devotional journal that I use sometimes. It's called Morning by Morning by Charles Spurgeon. You know, the language is reflective of his time, which was the mid to late 1800s. So that made his devotional a little bit more difficult to understand because some of the flowery language, right? However, I just read one the other day that really struck me. In essence, Charles Spurgeon was asking, why does God allow us to go through difficult times? If we have converted and we believe in Christ and we're living this life that models him, why then do we have to wander through this complex and difficult maze? The simple answer was, and the quote in his devotion was, we are here to glorify Christ in our daily life. We are here to be a blessing to the world. We often lose sight of the role we are in. Caregivers are doing the work of God. They are sowing the good seed. I know family caregiving can be messy, difficult, heartbreaking, and thankless. But I also know family caregivers are the angels that walk among us. They are doing what Romans 14:8 directed. For whether we live unto the Lord. And whether we die unto the Lord. Whether we live, therefore, or die, we are the Lord's. Now with that, take care of you as much as you take care of others. And I'll see you next week.